with Hand in Hand. Sylvia Gonzalez, who is works with Women Without Borders, Casa Latina, and is the co-chair of the Domestic Worker Standards Board, and SVP partner Jordan Goldwar, who is the executive director of One World Now. I want to welcome the three of you. Thank you so much for joining the SVP community. And again, a message to all the participants, if you haven't picked a channel, please pick a channel for English or Spanish because we are offering translation for this session. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Heather. As Heather said, I'm Dana Barnett. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm with the organization Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Network. And I'm so excited to be here with you today and to be here with my beloved and esteemed colleagues, Jordan and Sylvia. So I'm just gonna do a really quick introduction of what our goals are for today and our agenda, and then also find out a little more about who's in the room. So thank you for saying hello in the chat and letting us know your names and affiliations. And we're going to find out a little more about your own relationship to care, which all of us as humans have one. So for today, our goals are to explore together what it means for our home to be someone's workplace, beyond many of us are ourselves working from home. And also consider the history of domestic work in the United States, that history which is rooted in slavery and in immigrant and Black labor, mostly of women, and how the fact that it's rooted in those things has impacted and continues to impact labor laws and policy today. We're going to discuss the worker-led movements for domestic worker rights, and specifically, we're going to dig into the movement that birthed the Seattle Domestic Worker Ordinance and learn a little more about what is in that ordinance and what it means. And then best practices for implementing our values in our own homes, workers in our own homes, and also how we can take action and be advocates and supporters for domestic worker policy. So just to do a couple quick little polls to find out more about you and who's in the room. So we have our first poll is about care and your own relationship to care, which we know changes throughout our lives so many times. So we're asking currently, there's a poll, and let's see it, but the poll about what is your current relationship? Do you provide care for anyone in your own family or other families? Do you work as a domestic worker? Do you hire folks in your own home to provide care? So if folks wouldn't mind just responding to the poll. Okay, looks like we've got answers coming in. So we have a lot of people providing care for maybe children or elders, spouse, others in our homes. And it's really exciting. The information keeps changing. I feel like I'm in election night or something. So it's right now the leading in the polls is hiring domestic workers to provide care. And then we have several people who don't currently provide or hire anyone to provide care. And then our next question for you is, if you do employ a domestic worker in your home, what type of worker do you employ? So I don't know if that one, oh yeah, I see it's already going through. So 40% house cleaners, 30% gardeners. And it can be like thinking within maybe a year, can be very occasional. It could be once a year you hire a gardener, or once a month, once a week, you have a house cleaner. No nanny employers today. So great. Okay, wonderful. So I think I'll share these results with you all too. Great. So yeah, we want to keep all those relationships in mind, and keeping in mind that all of us are going to age, we're going to, different things will happen to us that we might need care to provide care for others in our lives at some point. And I'm going to turn it over to Sylvia Gonzalez from Casa Latina to give us that background in the history of work and the history of movements working for change and for rights. Slide. Oops, next slide. Thank you.
Gracias, Dana. Gracias a todos por darme la oportunidad de estar aquí y traer mi voz, pero no solamente mi voz, voz de muchas y muchos trabajadores del hogar que vivimos en el área de Seattle. Según las estadísticas, dicen que hay 33,000 trabajadores del hogar en la ciudad de Seattle. Entonces, vamos a estar hablando de esos 33,000 trabajadores del hogar. Nosotros, soy trabajadora del hogar, primero que nada. Mi nombre es Silvia, soy trabajadora del hogar. Tengo más de 15 años limpiando casas y me siento muy orgullosa del trabajo que hago. Siento que llego a las casas como con una varita mágica, ¿verdad? Porque veo el antes y veo el después y me siento muy satisfecha con el trabajo que hago y con el aporte que hago a la economía en este país. Y no solamente yo, sino mis compañeras trabajadoras del hogar que están también. Pero ser trabajadora del hogar no es fácil, ¿verdad? Porque estamos fuera de las leyes laborales. Y mi nombre es Silvia González nuevamente y soy coordinadora y líder de Mujeres Sin Fronteras en Casa Latina. Jordan, si puedes pasar a la siguiente diapositiva. Y me voy a estar aquí apoyando a mi compañero Jordan para si puede pasar las diapositivas de lo que voy a estar hablando. Sí, nosotros estamos fuera de los derechos laborales desde 1938, ¿verdad? Derechos tan básicos como cualquier otro trabajador, ¿verdad? Como lo que es tener garantizados 40 horas por semana o pagos extras o capacidad para sindicalizarnos o por lo menos un salario mínimo. Y ni hablar de lo que es tiempos de descanso, ¿verdad? Y todo esto excluyen a las trabajadoras del hogar y los trabajadores agrícolas, mano de obra tan importante para este país, ¿verdad? Entonces, desde 1964 prohíbe la discriminación en lugares de trabajo con más de 15 empleados. Imagínense, nosotros que vamos a trabajar a una casa, podíamos tener esa protección porque están hablando de más de 15 empleados en una casa, en un hogar, cuando mucho a veces puede haber 4 empleados, el jardinero, la niñera, la persona que está cocinando o la nani o la persona que está limpiando la casa. Entonces no estábamos protegidos para lo que es la discriminación o el acoso sexual. Entonces, toda esta lucha que hemos venido haciendo no es del año pasado, sino viene, como mencionaba Dana, desde el tiempo de la esclavitud. Las trabajadoras del hogar vienen desde el tiempo de la esclavitud, donde siempre han sido marginadas y hemos estado en una lucha constante por decir aquí estamos y merecemos derechos como cualquier otro, ¿verdad? Recuerdo un movimiento, y fue muy conocido, un movimiento por unas lavanderas en 1881, un grupo de lavanderas afroamericanas emancipadas se moviliza en Atlanta, Georgia, para lograr tener pagos más altos y tener derecho a uniforme. Imagínense, eran cosas tan básicas que ellas se movilizaron para poder decir, ¿sabes qué? Aquí estamos y tenemos derechos. Y podemos hablar desde mucho tiempo atrás de todo lo que se ha estado haciendo para poder lograr cambios en este movimiento de lo que es las trabajadoras del hogar. Y solamente menciono lo de las lavanderas porque es algo bien fuerte y todo este movimiento es por mujeres afroamericanas que vienen del tiempo de la esclavitud. Pero remontándonos un poquito a una era más reciente, Nueva York aprueba su primer domestic worker, una ordenanza en el 2010. Entonces, eso fue grandioso, ¿verdad? Nueva York, una ciudad tan grande con tantas niñeras, con tantas trabajadoras que limpian las casas y gana en el 2010. Eso fue el boom, ¿verdad? Como fue una ancla, un ejemplo para muchos estados. En el 2007 se crea la Alianza Nacional de Trabajadoras del Hogar, una organización nacional tan importante que se afilia a muchas organizaciones a nivel estatal, a diferentes estados, ¿verdad? De lo cual Casa Latina es una afiliada de la Alianza Nacional de Trabajadores del Hogar. ¿Y por qué menciono la Alianza Nacional de Trabajadoras del Hogar? Porque es, como mencionaba, es un ancla, es un punto tan importante. La ordenanza de Seattle, en el 2010 se hace la de Nueva York. En el 2019, Seattle fue la primera ciudad en toda la nación en ganar una carta de derechos para las trabajadoras del hogar. Fuimos como una explosión. Recuerdo cuando ganamos esa carta, toda la gente quería saber qué habíamos hecho, qué había funcionado, qué no había funcionado. Entonces, fue algo tan impresionante que no fue fácil, pero voy a seguir hablando de eso más adelante. Solamente quiero resaltar puntos y también vamos a estar hablando de una carta a nivel nacional de las trabajadoras del hogar que se introdujo por primera vez en el 2019 en el Congreso de los Estados Unidos y siendo las campeonas en aquel entonces la senadora Kamala Harris y la representante Pramila Jayapal. Ellas dos fueron las primeras sponsors de esta Carta de Derechos que se introdujo en el 2019. Entonces, Jordan, si quieres pasar a la siguiente, por favor. Y voy a estar hablando un poquito de las cartas de derechos. Actualmente tenemos 10 estados. Esta diapositiva es un poquito vieja porque no tenemos la actualizada, pero actualmente tenemos 10 estados que han ganado las cartas de derechos. Y todo esto con apoyo de la Alianza Nacional de Trabajadoras del Hogar. 10 estados que tienen como las cartas de derechos que tienen ganado como mínimo lo que es el salario mínimo y por lo regular todos esos son los que tienen nada más el derecho a que las trabajadoras del hogar tengan el salario mínimo. Son 10 estados y 3 ciudades. Uno de ellos es Filadelfia, otro de ellos obviamente es Seattle y otro de ellos es San Francisco. Son 3 ciudades diferentes que han ganado el derecho para las trabajadoras del hogar. Pero 3 ciudades, pero cada ciudad tiene sus puntos en particular. Y voy a hablar de la de Seattle, que fuimos la primera ciudad. ¿Y por qué es tan especial la de la ciudad de Seattle? Dana mencionó hace un momento que fue liderada por trabajadores del hogar. Y sí, efectivamente, tuvimos una alianza que se llamaba Seattle Domestic Worker Alianza, pero ellos eran como los que guiaban, pero en realidad los que lideraban eran los trabajadores del hogar. Los trabajadores del hogar eran los que estaban presentes en el City Hall, eran los que estaban presentes hablando en frente de los concejales, diciendo, necesitamos esto, merecemos esto y lo queremos ahora. Por esto otro, daban sus historias de ellas tan importantes y tan impactantes que eran. Si quieres avanzar a la que sigue, Jordan, por favor. Y yo recuerdo que el lanzamiento de la campaña fue tan importante porque como ustedes pueden ver, ese fue el lanzamiento de la campaña. Ver a tantas trabajadoras del hogar juntas en un lugar diciendo estamos aquí y queremos que nos escuchen, era increíble. Y solamente para dar un contexto, la mayoría de las trabajadoras del hogar son mujeres de color, inmigrantes que no tienen un estatus. Presentarse en cualquier lugar de la ciudad, en cualquier lugar donde hay personas relacionadas con la política, siempre son retos y retos grandes, miedos. Pero más sin embargo, ellas quieren un cambio en las leyes para beneficio de ellas mismas y su familia. Esta foto que aparece aquí fue el lanzamiento en diciembre del 2017, cuando empezamos con el movimiento para poder introducir una carta para las trabajadoras del hogar. Fue increíble, fue en las oficinas del sindicato SU 775. Si quieres pasar adelante, Jordan. Dana, y me avisas cuando mi tiempo se me vaya a terminar, porque yo puedo hablar toda la sesión, ¿verdad? Me llega tanto todo esto que yo puedo hablar mucho. Entonces, aquí está un grupo de trabajadoras y trabajadores del hogar, los cuales incluyen jardineros, cuidadoras de personas y en su mayoría son trabajadoras que forman parte del grupo de Mujeres Sin Fronteras, que la mayoría son trabajadoras del hogar. Vean en sus caras la alegría de estar ahí, introduciendo algo que va a ser beneficio para ellas y para sus familias, para poder llevar más dinero a su casa y ponerlo en la mesa. Si quieres introducir, Jordan, la que sigue, por favor, pasar la que sigue. Gracias, Jenna, me quedan 6 minutos. Aquí hicimos un movimiento afuera del City Hall, donde se simuló unas casitas, que esas casitas están hechas con pañales, que simbolizan las niñeras que están cuidando a los niños, ¿verdad? Y en la parte de arriba son guantes que usamos, las que limpiamos casas, incluso las niñas. Fue algo tan bonito, eso simbolizaba todas las trabajadoras que están ahí, que cuidan a personas, que cuidan a los niños y que cuidan de sus casas para que se mantengan limpias. Eso fue en mayo del 2018. Entonces, si quieres pasar, vamos a estar hablando de fotos, que para mí eso es lo que me llena, ¿verdad? Representa lo que hemos estado haciendo. Si quieres, en la que sigue, Jordan, por favor. Ahí estábamos con los testimonios en el City Hall. Estábamos llevando testimonios impactantes de cómo la comunidad LGBTQ también es bastante discriminada en este sector laboral, ya que muchas veces trabajamos en casas que nadie sabe que estamos trabajando dentro de esa casa. Como mujeres, como comunidad LGBTQ, muchas personas empiezan a hacer bullying, empiezan a acosar, empiezan a discriminar. Entonces era tan importante llevar las voces de ellos también a estos lugares y que supieran ellos que debíamos tener protecciones sobre lo que es el acoso sexual. Y no debía de haber 15 personas en una casa para poder decir, ¿sabes qué? Merezco este derecho. Con el solo hecho de que hubiera una sola persona, deberíamos de estar protegidos y lo logramos. Entonces, si quieres pasar adelante, yo, por favor. Estas fueron unas sesiones de escucha tan importantes porque nuestra campeona para esta Carta de Derechos fue la concejal Teresa Mosqueda. Ella se dio la tarea de tener sesiones de escucha tanto en el área del sur, del norte y local en Seattle, y escuchar a los trabajadores del hogar qué era lo que realmente les importaba, qué era lo más urgente que tenía que incluir esta Carta de Derechos. El que ella estuviera escuchando a los trabajadores del hogar, eso generó una confianza en ella y poder seguir los trabajadores liderando junto con ella esta campaña que fue impactante. Eso generó poder para los mismos trabajadores. Si quieres, Jordan, la que sigue, por favor. Aquí volvemos a ver las caras de las trabajadoras del hogar, escuchando y participando en las sesiones de escucha. Si quieres, la que sigue, Jordan, por favor. Ahí estábamos afuera del City Hall. El City Hall ya era como nuestra segunda casa también, porque cualquier movimiento, ahí estuvimos por semanas y días yendo a visitar el City Hall y haciéndonos presentes, que vieran que aunque somos invisibles dentro de las casas trabajando, podemos hacernos visibles cuando es justo y necesario. El que sigue, Jordan. Oh. Ahí fue otro evento que tuvimos afuera del City Hall, donde simbolizaban las puertas, porque siempre estamos atrás trabajando. Nadie sabe que hay gente trabajando. Fue un movimiento que se abrieron, hablando en sentido figurado, unas puertas se abrieron. Las trabajadoras del hogar tuvimos la oportunidad de salir de las sombras y decir, aquí estamos y queremos derechos. La que sigue, Jordan, por favor. Y nos vamos a ir rapidito porque el tiempo ya casi se me... El día 19 de julio del 2018 estábamos celebrando en el City Hall, donde por unanimidad todos los concejales, los 9 concejales dieron el sí para poder pasar esta ordenanza. La ordenanza tuvo la victoria el 19 de julio del 2018, entró en vigor hasta el 2019, pero tuvimos la oportunidad de estar celebrando ese día. Entonces fue increíble, hubo risas, hubo llanto, hubo cuando esa piel se eriza, ¿verdad? De ser la primera ciudad, y no nada más por ser la primera ciudad, sino como trabajadoras, poder tener ese derecho de decir, voy a tomarme un descanso de 10 minutos porque ya he limpiado 3 baños y ha sido exhaustivo y necesito un descanso de 10 minutos. O me voy a tomar media hora para poder comer, agarrar energía y poder seguir limpiando la casa. Eso es lo que ganamos ese día 19 de julio del 2018, entre otras cosas. Adelante, Jordan, por favor. Y ahí seguimos en nuestras sesiones de escucha y siempre haciendo justicia al lenguaje. La mayoría de las trabajadoras del hogar, nuestro primer idioma es el español, pero siempre hemos luchado en este movimiento por hablar nuestro primer idioma y siempre haciendo justicia al lenguaje. Y quiero agradecer a Cristal, que está aquí siendo mi voz y mis oídos en este espacio de Zoom. La que sigue, Jordan, por favor. La comunidad afrodescendiente ha sido también un pilar principal en este movimiento, porque aunque se erradicó la esclavitud, tenemos una esclavitud moderna, que aún existe mucho clasismo y racismo en esta sociedad donde vivimos, y tenemos que seguir lidiando con todo esto y seguir luchando con todo esto. Adelante, Jordan, la que sigue, por favor. Y sí, seguíamos celebrando y celebrando, es increíble. Ahí fue cuando al final fue la victoria, y atrás, ya que salimos de lo que era el City Hall, seguíamos celebrando. Ven la cara de felicidad de todos nosotros junto con nuestra champion de la Carta de Derechos, Teresa Mosqueda. Adelante, Jordan. Y creo que aquí en Casa Latina tuvimos la oportunidad de que viniera el alcalde a firmar la legislación, ¿verdad? Fueron momentos históricos que seguimos recordando y seguimos celebrando. Yo creo que Teina va a tener la oportunidad de hablar qué es lo que ganamos en todo este movimiento que fue por los trabajadores del hogar, ¿verdad? Tuvimos tantos trabajadores del hogar que fue increíble ver la necesidad, la desesperación de tener esos derechos, tener el derecho de descansar, tener el derecho de ganar por lo menos el salario mínimo, porque hay compañeras que dicen que trabajan 8 horas, perdón, en un día y a veces son pagadas por $50. Eso es injusto y es inhumano. Y esta Carta de Derechos vino a apoyarnos y a poder levantar la voz y que hubiera leyes que pudieran protegerlas a ellas. Adelante, Jordan. Creo que es la última, Jordan. Sí. Gracias. Y solamente mencionando, ¿verdad? Es una satisfacción tan grande el hecho de que tengamos una Carta de Derechos, que ahora las trabajadoras del hogar se sienten con ese valor de decir yo no trabajo por menos del salario mínimo. Y si no, acuden a organizaciones como Casa Latina y estamos empujando para que ellas sientan confianza y vayan a la oficina de estándares laborales también para meter su reclamo. No es fácil, ¿verdad? No es fácil. Venimos siendo oprimidas desde tiempos atrás y el hecho de que mucha comunidad no tiene un estatus también es una opresión, pero aún así mencionamos que no importa el estatus que tengamos, tenemos el mismo de derecho que cualquier persona que está legal en Estados Unidos. Entonces, si tienen preguntas, yo creo que más adelante va a haber oportunidad para responder las preguntas.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And yes, we will be doing a Q&A in a little bit, but please also feel free to put any questions that you have into the chat or into the chat, and we can get to them, but we'll also have dedicated space for that. Thank you so much, Sylvia. I've heard this presentation many times, and it still is so deeply moving to hear it. Even being a little bit of a part of it, I'm still moved to hear it, and I really just appreciate the way that it does highlight some of just the key issues of the invisibility, the lack of value for workers, and how that intersects with immigrant justice, with racial justice, gender justice, disability justice. So this issue is really just at the heart and center of so much for that impacts all of our lives. And so I'm going to just go really briefly over the Seattle Domestic Worker Ordinance and what is actually in the bill, and what we're now still working to achieve as we try to extend the policy in Seattle. And then I'm going to talk more about the organization that I now work for, Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Network, and the role of also employers and allies in the struggle for domestic worker rights, and how this is something that's really we all have such a stake in and can be such a valuable part of this work. So slide. And thank you, Jordan. So a couple of the things that the ordinance did: one, it defined who a domestic worker is. And that's actually really important because it is something that people don't always understand. So the one thing I'll really get into about it is this idea of, I think there's an idea that there's casual workers and there's domestic workers. And I think there's some confusion about where workers fall. So there is a definition of casual labor, who casual laborers are not included in the ordinance. And that is a very small sector, really, of the people who are doing this work. So it can be confusing because for myself as an employer, I might hire someone very casually. It might feel casual to me. Maybe it's just once a month, or for a house cleaner, or once a year, or twice a year for a gardener. So I might think, well, that's casual, so this worker is a casual worker. But that's not how it's defined. It's not defined by the employer's relationship. It's defined by the worker's relationship and how they define themselves. So it really is that if somebody identifies this as their work, then they're a domestic worker. If this is the way that they're getting income, whether or not it's part-time, which it is for many people, not by their choice, but because the work can be limited, especially now with the pandemic, or it's full-time. It's really up to the worker themselves. So who would be a casual worker would be, if you have a neighbor who sometimes takes care of your children, maybe they're retired and they're just doing this more as a favor or to get a little extra cash, like, sure, that would be a casual worker. If it's someone in your family, they're not protected under the domestic worker bill of rights. Maybe in some cases they should be, but they're not. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that, and feel free to ask questions. But I think it's really important, and it's something that we see reflected all over, like even as we fight for the National Bill of Rights and we have opposition to that, part of the opposition is them saying that this isn't real work, it's casual work. And so that's not true. What we're saying is this is real work, it's skilled labor, it takes a lot of skills and expertise. Okay, slide. And so it also defines who a hiring entity is, which that's the language that is used by the city of Seattle, is hiring entity, which is really anyone who employs a domestic worker. So even if you employ through, you hire a cleaner through a cleaning service, you are still a hiring entity, as well as that service is also a hiring entity. So you both have responsibility to making sure that the ordinance is complied with. Slide. And so Sylvia named a lot of these things, really basic things that are in the Bill of Rights. And we always talk about it hand in hand, and also with the standards board, that this is a floor, it's not a ceiling. So minimum wage, right to minimum wage, which right now it just changed in Seattle. I think it's a little under $19 an hour. It's like $18.70 something, I think. Right to meal and rest breaks. And that can be something that can be complicated to figure out, like if you have a nanny or if you have a home attendant who's taking care of someone with disabilities, or how can they take a break. So it opens the door, but everyone needs breaks, right? We all need breaks. Our bodies need breaks and our minds need breaks, and we're gonna take them no matter what. And so and it's a right that we all have. And so part of that, sometimes there can be questions about how that works, and I'll just answer one of the bigger questions is if a worker can't take a break, and a break really means a break. It doesn't mean, someone who's hired as a nanny is also cleaning, or they're also talking with you, or, something else. It's like a real 30-minute break for lunch. And if you can't do it, you would talk together and say, okay, there's not going to be a break, but we're going to pay an extra for that extra 30 minutes. And then really, again, like really basic stuff like that. And these rights, it always amazes me that domestic workers, don't have these rights in many cases still, to be free from discrimination and sexual harassment. And, this is like an area of work where discrimination and sexual harassment can and does happen quite frequently. It's inside people's homes and closed doors. Workers have very little power, are often the only one there. So, it's kind of amazing that up until this point, workers have not had a right to be free from discrimination or sexual harassment. But in Seattle, they are. And that you can't use immigration status against someone. So you can't hold on to anyone's documents, threaten them with going to authorities for immigration, like that is not legal. And then it created the Domestic Worker Standards Board. And that's a board that's made up of workers and employers, worker organizations, employer organizations, and some community members. And it's also a board that's currently looking for some employers to join. Jordan can talk more about that. So Jordan, Sylvia, and I were all on the standards board. I no longer am, but I had the privilege of being on it and co-chairing with Sylvia for 3 years, and Sylvia continues to co-chair the board. And that board was created because we know that this is really just a beginning. This is what was able to pass at the time, but there is so much of a need for more. And like Sylvia brought up already, paid time off is something that right from the beginning, workers have identified as something that they need to be able to take a sick day for themselves or for a family member, to care for a family member. but it wasn't something that we were able to get into the initial ordinance. So those are some of the things that the standards board is working on now, as well as implementation, which, you know, I think is so interesting of like, how do you implement something like this? There's over 30,000 domestic workers in the city of Seattle, but there's no one place where those workers are and where employers are, you know, so part of the job of the board is to think about how is the outreach going? What are the best strategies for outreach? What kind of tools do people need, including employers and workers, to implement it? And also how is to overview enforcement and see, are workers actually feeling safe enough to make claims? If not, why not? And also, what could the Office of Labor Standards, who this ordinance is under, could be doing to make sure that they're enforcing the ordinance? Slide. And so additionally, sorry, I think I'm going a little long, but additionally, the board was charged with a task to create recommendations and to deliver them to the city council around these issues that I just outlined, and that city council would have to respond to these recommendations. So the board did make them. If people are interested, we can point you to them. And those recommendations were all around some of the things that I've already mentioned, of just really making this, it's amazing and so important. We need these laws on the books because not having laws on the books is so detrimental. But we also need them to really be real, be a reality for people. And so that's what the recommendations were around, how to really make these rights a reality for workers. And the recommendations that we made to city council were all approved, and we were given $500,000 last year to put towards going towards the recommendations. But the paid time off is something, and all of them, but mainly the paid time off is something that it's going to take us quite a while to figure out, and that we're still going to need a lot of community support from employers and allies in order to move that forward. Next. So I won't go too into this, but again, you know, taking a day off or a week off when you're sick, if you have COVID, if your child does, it's just something obviously that we all need. And also domestic workers don't qualify for workers' comp currently, or workers' comp excludes most domestic workers. So, you know, we've heard so many testimonials from workers who are going to work sick, they're going to work hurt, they're exacerbating their conditions that they have, and they're not keeping themselves or other people safe because they can't, right? Because they can't take that time off. And legally, we do all have the right to pay time off, and we have the right to accrue that paid time off. Most domestic workers don't get it. The main ones who do are nannies who are on a payroll system, and are working full time, you know, but for house cleaners who are working for multiple employers, we don't have anything set up to make it very easy for those employers to kind of pay into paid time off. So that's what we're working on now. Next. Thank you so much, Jordan. So again, just the need for paid time off. We can definitely talk more about those. Next slide. We have a lot about paid time off because it's really important. And I think everybody probably understands how important it is. Next slide. Great. Okay. So this is also me, but it's a little bit of a topic shift. So I'm going to just like do a little of this. So maybe we can pretend that a new person is talking. So just a little shift for you. So now I just want to talk a little bit about Hand in Hand, the organization I work for, and the role, like I said, Sylvia has talked to us about the role of workers to lead the movements and to be there testifying. And there is also a really strong role for employers and allies to make these changes in how domestic worker rights are and are valued. And so Hand in Hand is a national organization. And next slide. And it's made up of domestic employers, family caregivers, and allies all over the country. It was founded in New York. So Sylvia in the beginning talked about the New York State was the first state to have a Bill of Rights. And that's when Hand in Hand started, was through the organizing that employers did to support that campaign. So employers organized to support the National Domestic Workers Alliance to pass that bill. And we saw there how important that role is and how necessary it is. And even more recently with the national bill and the opposition that we hear, the opposition is always couched in that employers don't want this. Employers can't do this. It's too much for employers to, to manage rights for workers in their homes. And so it is so important that employers show up to say, not in our name, we want the workers in our homes to have rights, and that we all benefit from this. And so what we do at Hand in Hand is we bring these groups together and we really can think about and talk about our shared stake in this work, right? Because whether or not you're a parent or, someone doing this work for your family or doing this work for pay, the work of care, which is the basis for all life on the planet, right, is the basis for our economy, is not valued work. And so we have different positions within this. It impacts all of us differently, right? But it is really important for all of us. Like, we all need care in our life. We all give care to others. And so we focus both on the rights of domestic, I think slide. So on winning protections for domestic workers, and we also focus on throughout the country on affordable care, on long-term supports and services for seniors and people with disabilities. We know that this isn't, although employers have a really important role to play in providing equity for workers, it's not just employers, it's a larger, we need a lot of employers themselves also need support to be able to afford the care that they need. And so we have a large part of our base is people with disabilities who might not be able to afford to pay workers what they need, but absolutely believe that those workers should get that pay. And so it can be about, raising the wage on a state level, as well as, and subsidizing, as well as people, being fair and treating workers fairly in their own homes. So that is a big part of what we do is we organize, we bring people together and our members lead that work. And we also provide resources and support for people who have people working in their homes, because we know that we don't have HR in our homes. And that for many of us, myself included, I had even worked as a nanny when I was younger, but when I had a baby and had to hire a nanny, I didn't know, even though I knew I had the values, I still didn't really know how to do it in an equitable way. I didn't know everything to think about. So we have a ton of resources for people. We have, hiring tips from the time of hiring, checklists, contracts, and best practices for just having difficult or uncomfortable conversations. So we're also providing people with those and also helping people to recognize that they are employers, even if they don't think of themselves that way, even if they think of it as more of a casual relationship, as we said, or, that they just, and that it's okay to be an employer of a domestic worker, because for some, especially there's, some class issues involved, there's some guilt involved when it comes to parenting and hiring a nanny. There's different things that come up for people. So we also just really create a space where people can identify as employers and get the resources and support they need, and also understand their stake in fair care for everyone. Next slide. So one way that we do that is through the Fair Care Pledge. So this is something that that we promote, and we focus on the three kind of main principles of fair care, which is fair pay, clear expectations, and pay time off. So in Seattle, we do have an ordinance that tells us what to do for some of these things. Although, of course, we don't think the minimum wage is a living wage. So we always recommend people paying the living wage, not a minimum wage. But our organization is all across the country, and all across the country, we share these best practices, whether or not it's the law or not, to give paid time off, to give breaks, and to provide clear expectations. And so we asked, one thing that people can do is to take this Fair Care Pledge, and then we can support people with resources in order to do that in their homes. Next. Yeah, so again, we have a lot of resources, and we are happy to provide folks with those resources. We'll give this PowerPoint afterwards and follow up with resources, and we're always willing, we're always here to help. Next slide. And so just some pictures of our employers really being side by side with domestic workers, fighting to raise those standards. And I think Jordan will talk more about what that experience is like as an employer. I know for myself, I've also been a hand-in-hand member before being on staff, and it's really an honor to get to be part of these campaigns and get to share space with workers and support this work that is so essential and means so much to all of us. Next. I think that's Jordan.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dana. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Sylvia. And it really is an honor to be here together in solidarity with both of you and with everybody else who's joining on the call. And so thank you so much for being here today. Also great to see lots of friends and family on the call. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jordan Goldwarg. I use he, him pronouns. I've served on the City of Seattle's Domestic Worker Standards Board for 2.5 years now, and my husband and I have been SVP partners for close to 10 years. So my experience with domestic workers began long before I even knew what a domestic worker was. I grew up in Montreal with a significant amount of wealth privilege, which meant that my parents could afford to have help in the home. We had a number of live-in nannies who, in addition to taking great care of me and my brother, also helped out with cooking and cleaning. As we got older and outgrew the need for nannies, we continued to employ a house cleaner who helped ensure that a house with 2 messy boys stayed sparkling clean. While this was simply my reality growing up, years later, I began to understand just how pivotal a role these nannies and house cleaners played in my family's life. In addition to being another loving, caring, and supportive adult in the house, they allowed my mom and dad, who are here on the call today, thank you for joining, to balance being excellent parents while also pursuing their own career goals. And the nannies allowed my parents to be fully present for me and my brother when they got home at the end of the day, as illustrated by this photo of my dad reading us a bedtime story when I was just shy of 3 years old. So as we like to say in the domestic worker movement, domestic work is the work that allows all other work to happen. Fast forward many years to 2010, my now husband and I had just moved to Seattle, and as a present, my mom got us a gift card to a house cleaning service. She knew that we were starting to get very busy with our jobs and wanted to make our lives just a little bit easier. Now, even though I had grown up with nannies and house cleaners, I have to admit that I felt a little strange employing a house cleaner as an adult. And I realized that I was carrying a lot of internalized stigma and shame around the tremendous privilege that I held. Especially since I was working in education, where a lot of my colleagues could not afford to hire a domestic worker. I was frankly embarrassed that this was something that was just normal to me. And as I would learn, and as Dana already talked about, this stigma of talking about domestic work is one of the biggest barriers to achieving rights and protections for domestic workers. Not only does it prevent employers from learning more about our rights and responsibilities, but it also reinforces the notion that domestic work is not real work. In reality, domestic work is essential work, and domestic workers deserve just as much respect dignity, and recognition as people engaged in any other profession. Fortunately, the power of community organizing saved me. Around 2018, a good friend named Erica Sklar started working for Hand in Hand, and being the amazing organizer that she is, she asked me to start thinking about my role in the domestic worker economy. She asked if my book club would consider reading Made, a memoir that had just come out and that paints in great detail the struggles of one domestic worker to make ends meet in our broken economy. And admittedly, she's a domestic worker who benefits from the privileges of being white, English speaking, and a US citizen. Erica then hosted a screening of the film Roma, which chronicles the lives of two live-in domestic workers in an upper-class Mexican family in the 1970s. Sometimes in our lives, the right combination of things happens at the right time to catalyze us towards action. In this case, Erica's organizing efforts, combined with reading the book and watching the film, convinced me that this was a movement I wanted to be a part of. So when Erica encouraged me to apply for a position on the standards board, I said yes. So I know from the poll at the beginning today that I'm not the only employer of a domestic worker on this call. And so I want to say a few words about why it's so important for us to be allies and accomplices in this movement. When I think about my own racial justice journey, I can actually thank SVP for being a major source of learning for me. Through a number of cohort-based programs and peer accountability groups, and some of you are on this call here today as well, I started to understand how to move from learning to action. I began to understand the urgency of giving up power, using my privilege to create change, and building coalitions with others. And I began to understand that there's no way that I can be free unless and until everyone is free. Advocating for domestic worker rights has been a way to embody these lessons through cross-racial, cross-class organizing. The work of the Standards Board tries to center the voices and experiences of workers, which has taught me so much about everything from language justice to the importance of community engagement to the necessity of just slowing down. From an advocacy perspective, it has also provided me with an opportunity to participate in really tangible, satisfying victories, when those victories have often seemed so rare over the past few years. Here's a screenshot of the city's 2022 budget showing the $500,000 that Dana talked about that helps to implement recommendations that the Standards Board made to help further strengthen the city's domestic worker ordinance. That funding was the direct result of advocacy from board members and our allies. And the energy that I get from victories like this creates momentum that allows me to engage in other advocacy efforts. This work has also allowed me to build relationships with people coming from very different backgrounds than myself. Here's a photo of me and Sylvia in Washington, DC back in May, when we participated in a lobby day for a national domestic worker bill of rights. And if you can't tell from being on this call today, I really think that everybody's life would be so much better if they just got to spend more time with Sylvia. In short, engaging in the movement for domestic worker rights is one way to show up for racial justice in a really, really tangible way. And since this is an SVP event, I want to be really explicit about why I think it's important for SVP partners to be involved in this movement. Historically, most SVP partners carry tremendous power and privilege in the world. My questions for you are, how are you going to use that power and that privilege? How are you going to work toward justice? How are you going to be an accomplice? For me, when I dream of the world that I want to live in, I want everyone to have the benefits and rights that I do. And if I'm not helping to make it that way, then I'm complicit in the status quo. So how can you be involved? As we start to wrap up, Sylvia, Dana, and I want to share 5 things that you can do to be an accomplice. First, as we've mentioned, there's currently an effort to pass a national domestic workers bill of rights. And it probably won't surprise you, as Sylvia mentioned, to know that the lead sponsor in the House is our own Pramila Jayapal. If someone could put the link in the chat to sign the petition in support of this bill, we'd love for you to sign it. Second, sign Hand in Hand's Fair Care Pledge and share it with 5 of your friends. And the sharing part is really important. As we've said, one of the biggest obstacles that we face is that employers often simply don't know what they need to do in order to be responsible employers. And this pledge helps all of us to be more educated. Third, volunteer with Casa Latina. They have a really wide range of volunteer opportunities available, and it's a great way to build relationships with domestic workers and learn more about their work. Fourth, bring a discussion like this to your community, just like we're doing today. You can bring it to your book club, your office, your faith group, your PTA, or any other group that you're a part of. And you can reach out to Dana to help with scheduling it. And finally, join the Washington Network as a member of Hand in Hand, through which you can engage in learning opportunities, participate in events, network with other employers, and more. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the slideshow, and I think we're going to open it up for questions. Dana, are you facilitating, moderating the Q&A? Who's doing that?
I'm happy to do that. Are people able to come off mute to ask a question? Do they have the power to do that?
Dana, I see a question earlier from the chat, earlier in the conversation. Jim McVitie is asking, help us understand why a home care worker paid with public funds is excluded.
Yeah, I can do my best. I don't know if Sylvia, if you have more information from being kind of on the floor when that decision was made. So this might change. This is something that is still an open discussion, an open conversation. It's mainly, my understanding is that home care workers paid with public funds like Medicaid or Medicare are are unionized and have their own methods for setting and fighting for wages and conditions. Sylvia, yeah.
Tienes toda la razón, Dana. Es exactamente por eso, aunque cuando se iban a hacer las recomendaciones, estaban luchando por apelar esa sección, pero no se hizo nada, así es que seguimos en lo mismo, ¿no? Ellos, como son parte de un sindicato y tienen sus propios beneficios, ellos están un poquito fuera de esta ley.
Does anyone have any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or to just come off mute and ask.
Hi, I have a question. I'm just wondering, if there's like in terms of encouraging responsible hiring of domestic workers, particularly among, as you were talking about the SVP community, being engaged with the domestic worker community. Is there a way of promoting certain employers that have good practices around employing domestic workers? So I'm thinking, like, I know of a particular company who I know they give benefits to their workers, and I know that they provide health care, but I wouldn't have known that if a friend of mine had told me about it. So is there a way of knowing who does that, and do you share that out?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Thank you. And it's one that we actually get quite a lot. And I've recently been tabling at farmers markets, and it's often the people who come up are often people who are actually in the process of hiring and looking for good entities to hire with. We always recommend Casa Latina for hiring cleaners or gardeners. And there are some other organizations who have been involved in the ordinance Like there are some nanny organizations that, you know, who connect folks who have been involved, but we don't have a formal, like Hand in Hand doesn't have a formal list. But I actually think it's something that we should do. And I would love to hear the name of the company that you're referring to. Because I think that would be a great thing for us to provide. I don't know, Sylvia or Jordan, if you know of anything, any list of kind of fair care committed organizations.
I don't know of any list, but I think, you know, one thing that helped me was as I started to learn more about what the bare minimum should be, both through the Domestic Workers Ordinance and also through being a member of Hand in Hand, I was then able to go back to the house cleaning company that we hire through and say, hey, you know, this is stuff I've been learning about. Can you tell me about what you do for your employees? And they were both like really happy to engage in that conversation, first of all, which, you know, I think was a good sign. And then also, you know, were able to tell me all the specific things that they were doing that were in compliance with the ordinance. And I think if you were to have that conversation, you know, as you were trying to decide who to hire for something, first of all, if they are not able to tell you what they're doing or not willing to tell you what they're doing or don't even know that the ordinance exists, those would all be red flags, I think, that would give you pause with that company.
Ya, gracias, Jordan y Dana. Uno de los retos más grandes que hay es que obviamente las compañías que tienen trabajadoras del hogar están tratando de cubrir los requisitos mínimos, como lo que es el salario mínimo, ¿verdad? Pero uno de los retos más grandes que hay son las personas que trabajan solas, las que limpian casas independientes, que no son por medio de una compañía, porque las que trabajan en compañías de una u otra forma, la compañía le paga por lo menos el mínimo. Pero cuando yo, Silvia, me presento quizás con Jordan y le digo, ok, voy a trabajar contigo, no hay nadie que me represente, es ahí donde hay los retos más grandes, donde quizás Jordan en cierto momento no me puede pagar lo que yo negocié, ¿verdad? Esos retos para las personas individuales son los que hay más grandes. Entonces, y es lo que estamos tratando con OLS y el Domestic Workers Standard Board, de cómo llegar a los empleadores y no yo, Silvia, decirle a Jordan, yo estoy protegida bajo una ordenanza, porque Jordan quizás puede ignorar lo que yo le estoy diciendo y él puede pagarme lo que él quiera. Pero este grupo de empleadores que está aquí puede ayudarnos a las trabajadoras del hogar, ustedes a correr la voz con los demás empleadores y decir todos los trabajadores tienen derechos y nosotros como trabajadores también correr voz, ¿verdad? No esperar a que nada más yo le diga a Jordan que tengo derechos, sino que haya de los dos lados para poder llegar a algo más neutral, ¿verdad? Sí.
Thanks, Sylvia. And I'll add to that Hand in Hand, getting involved with Hand in Hand is a great way to do that. We have a lot of information that is ready to share, and from, you know, social media posts that can be reposted and shared in Facebook groups or on your personal pages, or to emails, templates with information that you can share with family and friends or whomever. So that we find that absolutely with this sector of labor, peer-to-peer is one of the best ways, both between workers and between employers. And also that's how so many workers get hired, is through, you know, a recommendation from a peer. And so that's just one of the most important ways that we can organize and educate others. And I also just wanted to share that, Sylvia, I agree with what you're saying, that one of our biggest, what we're really trying to focus on is absolutely the individual households who employ individuals. And we also know that some of these larger companies are not following the ordinance or abiding by labor laws. And so that's the area where the Office of Labor Standards has had some of their biggest kind of cases and accomplishments is with, you know, there was a recent case with, I think it was Handy, and I don't want to say anything that's not true. We can send follow-up information, but there was a case with a lot of these larger like internet-based services who were really not following the local laws. And so that is something to be really cautious of. And I think the tips that Jordan gave are really relevant for how you can kind of interview an agency or organization to find out what their practices are.
I have a question about sort of protecting whistleblowers and what are their teeth now? I mean, the law is fantastic, and I've worked a fair amount with organized labor, and I would not be surprised if many employers, particularly individual households, are not following the new law. What are the mechanisms to help with enforcement, education and enforcement?
Great question. Does anyone want to, who would like to take it?
Yo puedo intentar contestar lo mejor que se pueda, ¿verdad? Pues creo que es uno de los grandes retos que tenemos, ¿verdad? Cómo enforzar la ley. Y primero que nada, no ha habido muchas quejas ante OLS. Tenemos 3 años ya con una carta de derechos y no ha habido muchas quejas. No sabemos si es porque no ha llegado la información suficiente a trabajadores, más que nada a los trabajadores, o es el miedo, o es el difícil acceso a imponer una queja en OLS. Cuando la comunidad indocumentada, cuando hay comunidades que no tienen un estatus, da miedo llegar a una oficina como OLS, ¿verdad? Y si me hacen preguntas sobre el estatus, aunque sabemos que eso no afecta el estatus y puede la gente someter su reclamo, aún así existen muchos miedos. Por eso las personas a veces deciden no someter su caso, siguen siendo víctimas, pero es necesario seguir llevando la información, seguir insistiendo. Tienes derecho, no importa estés legal o no estés legal, y sabemos que cuando hay personas que meten demandas o meten reclamos y no tienen un estatus, es un ejemplo para otras personas que levanten su voz. Entonces es algo que tenemos que seguir trabajando para que pueda haber esto. También otro de los retos es el idioma, que lo hemos estado hablando, la justicia del lenguaje. Si tú vas a meter un reclamo OLS y no hay alguien que hable tu idioma, ¿qué caso tiene que vayas si no hay alguien que te va a ayudar? Entonces es algo en lo que hemos estado trabajando desde que iniciamos en este proceso, el acceso al idioma o el español o el vietnamís o el tagalo, lo que sea necesario, y en eso se está trabajando. Quizás no va a ser un cambio de hoy para mañana, pero en eso estamos trabajando y vamos a seguir insistiendo.
Yeah, it's also why in this industry, we're so focused on individual employers, which is very different in some ways than other types of like labor organizing work. Because it really is, we've heard from so many workers that it takes so much to raise something with an employer because they're in such a place of lack of power. And while organizations like Casa Latina and the National Domestic Workers Alliance work with workers to make sure they know their rights and they do feel like they can stand up for themselves, employers being proactive and saying, I know about this ordinance, even if that feels a little awkward, and having it in whatever language, having the information, which the Office of Labor Standards does have a notice of rights in English and in Spanish and Chinese, or in a few different languages. And so you can present that to a worker to make sure that they know what it is. And then that also will help them when they have other employers who might not be going along with those rights.
Can I add one thing there, Dana? So we talked about the $500,000 that we won in funding to support the recommendations of the Standards Board. And part of that pot of money was distributed this summer to community groups through an application process. And one of the groups that's going to be receiving funding their proposal was specifically around providing support to nannies who want to bring complaints against their employers. And so this was like a really innovative proposal, like a new model that we hadn't seen before. We were really excited to be able to fund it. And I think that just points to like the importance of continuing to go to do community engagement and listening to the solutions that communities are proposing. Another idea that's been proposed that we haven't been able to implement yet is having essentially like a workers' protection fund that would help to provide funding to whistleblowers who lose their job because of bringing a complaint against their employer. And so there are solutions out there, but it's going to take time and money to implement them. But there's a lot of really creative stuff that's being proposed that will, I think, help with the enforcement challenge that we've had before.
Yeah, and one last thing is, if you know domestic workers either working for you or in your life, connecting them with organizations so that they do have that power and support is so important as well. So there's the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Casa Latina for house cleaners and gardeners. There's the Nanny Collective, which is part of Fair Work Center for nannies in Seattle. So having that support and that the organizational power is so important.
Thank you. Wonderful. Well, we are getting close to time. I don't know if anyone has any other questions for our panel right now. You can come off mute or put it in the chat. All right. Well, I would love to thank everyone for joining us this hour, for sharing the space and hearing these stories. Really incredible, powerful work. So much has been accomplished, and we can continue to accomplish more as a community and a coalition working to uphold domestic workers' rights. We have our calls to action. That is fantastic. 5 very clear actions that we can all take. Thank you, Crystal, for your work interpreting, and a huge thank you to Sylvia, Dana, and Jordan for sharing your stories and your work with us. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all so much. Bye.
Gracias.
Thank you, everybody.
Gracias, Cristal.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tali.